Yeah, welcome everybody to this webinar on climate change scenario services and the concept and the toolkit we developed in the Senses project to make climate change scenario services really a concrete enterprise and also give a concrete prototypical example how climate change scenarios could look like, climate change scenario services could look like. And let me, before I give you an overview on the Senses project, quickly motivate or make the case for climate change scenario services. Why do we need such a thing and what is it? So first, climate change scenarios have become more relevant than ever in recent years. And the prime example is certainly the use of climate change scenarios by the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change on climate change assessments, but also other international and national climate change assessments. This is a long-standing use of scenarios. Obviously, climate change is highly uncertain, and also its course will depend on our actions. So scenarios are an important tool to explore these futures and what we can do about it. But in the recent years, the interest has grown beyond the climate policy community in climate change scenarios. They are now used a lot for national and subnational energy transition planning. They are of great interest for assessing financial risk related to climate change and also business alignment with low carbon goals and the transformation to low carbon and zero carbon societies. And they're very important to connect to discussions about sustainable development, as, for example, they relate to informing the UN SDG agenda. So with this increased profile of scenarios, there is, of course, the need to bring those scenarios to a larger set of users. Now, there are two important properties of scenarios I would like to highlight. One is climate scenarios can be a tool for strategic planning, but it's important to understand what they are and what they are not in order to use it for these purposes. First, they are not predictions of the future, but rather they are exploring the future to inform different courses of action. And that's the strategic planning element of it. So we can ask two questions with scenarios. Both are useful to ask and both play their role. Often they are asked in concert. So the first question is, what can happen? Just try to explore possible futures. Also futures when it comes, for example, to climate impact projections, to highlight what we are facing and point out the need to act. And the second set of scenarios is exploring the question was what should happen in order to reach societal goals, long-term goals, such as the Paris climate goals. So these scenarios are mapping out pathways to desirable futures. In the end, scenarios are critically important to help us to organize and coordinate our thinking across various actors in society, so societal actors, political actors, businesses, and science. Now, my third point, why we need climate change scenario services to make it more accessible to a broader set of users, is that scenarios are quite complex objects and require guided access. What's important to recognize with scenarios is that they come to life by exploring them as a set. So not a single scenario giving you a prediction, because it's not a prediction, is important, but rather a set of scenarios to identify implications of different courses of actions and the trade-offs and synergies between them. I give you a list of scenario pairs that are often looked at. For example, a baseline scenario without significant policy intervention versus a policy scenario. Immediate action versus delayed action, sustainability oriented versus resource intensive, or on the impact side, there are also different variants. For example, are we looking at a wet or a dry future climate condition and these kind of things. So that's important to keep in mind, and that's why we need to have scenario services to be able to tell the user about the context that scenarios are embedded in. So the Senses project started with the idea to try to provide a prototypical example of these services with the main goal to make these climate change scenarios more accessible and usable to selected user groups. And the one is, of course, to more effectively communicate key insights that you can learn from those scenarios, but also to empower the users to explore scenario information. So here you have an overview on the type of scenarios that we were looking at. We were not focusing only on, for example, emission scenarios, as they would come from integrated assessment models and describe the energy and land use transition to come to long-term emissions and climate goals. We are also taking into account climate change projections, and associated with these climate change projections, also climate impact projections. In the project, we developed our tools together with stakeholders in order to get a good assessment how fit for purpose they are. And particularly we focused on stakeholders from climate policy, from the climate policy community, on business actors, particularly from the finance sector, and also regional actors. Now, my last slide on the consortium. We are a group of 5 institutions. I'm from the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, and we have coordinated this project. We came in with an expertise in integrated assessment and climate impact modeling. We were joined by our colleagues from YASA, from Austria, also with the expertise on integrated assessment modeling. But then we had 2 partners with expertise on scenario co-production, and also regional scenarios from the Wageningen University and the Stockholm Environment Institute. And finally, last but not least, very important, we also had a group working on data visualization and communication design. The entire project was funded under the Joint Program Initiative and the European Research Area for Climate Services. And this is a joint EU and national funding, and our national funders from Germany, from Austria, from the Netherlands, and from Sweden are listed here as well. So with that, thank you for this, and I'm handing over to Cornelia.
Thank you very much, Elmar. Perfect on time. You heard my alarm, so I didn't even need to warn you. So I would like to introduce now Cornelia Auer, who will go a bit more in depth about the ecosystems, the service concept, the climate service concept. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simona and Elmar. So I have the honor to talk about the service concept we developed within Senses. And as Elmar already explained, climate change scenarios are a special type of scientific information, and a climate change scenario service as such is unprecedented. So we were really lucky that we had a group of excellent stakeholders, as Elmar also already mentioned, that helped us to co-produce the service concept and the elements we found most important in order to deliver a service that provides a bridge from the wealth of information that is in climate change scenarios to a broader user community. And the first element that was clear very early in the beginning of the project is that we need to focus in the service on digestible information. Capacity building takes a big place in our service concept, and contextualization is an important aspect. The users need to know what climate change scenarios are on the one hand, but on the other also, how does that relate to their world, to their work, and how can they employ them? To provide access, we chose also different levels of complexity, staged access to the scenario information. So along this hierarchy of complexity, we take the user into the scenario information, and gradually the user learns more about what scenarios are and how they can be used. Then for digestible information, visualization plays an immense role. Nothing is as powerful to convey like a lot of information in one picture, and Senses is a lot about really great visualizations that the colleagues from the FH Potsdam developed. Then for the more experienced users, I mean, the digestible information is to give people access to the scenario information. And for the more experienced users, we learned from the stakeholders that we must focus on being relevant and providing actionable information. This sounds somewhat obvious, but it was really for us a special step to understand that we cannot only present our science, but that we have to understand, or that we have to think, how can our science be made relevant for the world of the stakeholders? And this is a special step, and we are really grateful that we were hinted to that aspect so clearly. And one important aspect is transparency. The stakeholders need to know what information they have and how it has been developed. Guidance and orientation. There is a lot of information there, and it is often also given in academic jargon. So we need to guide the stakeholders along there. Then up-to-date information is also very important to be relevant and to provide actionable data. So we needed to provide a flexible infrastructure that can be updated regularly. And also co-production is an important aspect, because climate change scenarios are not only to gather information, but also to co-produce information. This is what Elmar explained before. So we also offer helping material for co-production of climate change knowledge. Now, this is presented to the users in a more simpler concept. We have 3 pillars. The learn pillar. This pillar focuses on communicating the scenario insights and fundamentals. Then the explore pillar. This helps people to really get into the data and to become more autonomous in understanding and in using the data. It would also be more the area where the up-to-date information always appears. And then we have a share pillar. This is where users can download information or also figures, which they can then use in their work. So here you see a sketch of the toolkit concept. You see how we guide along the user from learn modules, which are more easier to digest, to explore modules. We have different levels of complexity, also to the raw scenario data. And one thing we also learned with our stakeholders, another important aspect is also to connect. So learn, explore, share is important, but also connecting to establish data providers, for example, that the users already know, also gives a high value in order to have orientation what they are dealing now with. We also hope that soon we can connect to our sister project Easypedia, who focus on impact data. And I think in the sake of time, I would pass on to my colleague Francesca Morini, who will present the toolkit itself now.
Thank you, Connie. That was a very clear introduction. Let's see now Francesca Morini.
Hello, everyone. I will, as Cornelia just said, I will guide you through the structure of the toolkit again from a more design perspective, and then I will start with a short demo. So as it was previously said, the toolkit is a unique collection of user-centered scenario visualizations, and to achieve that, we also, as it was already pointed out, with various stakeholders from different groups. And design-wise, it was really interesting because we had to set up a good environment to actually raise the correct question and ask for also to achieve the correct answers. So we set up from the beginning a series of co-design workshops to initially frame bigger questions and frame the project in general, and then to in a more granular way establish visual ideas. Our group of stakeholders was quite diverse. We had stakeholders from finance, as Elmar already pointed out, also from policy and regional scenario makers. And by starting with the idea of creating a modular structure, then we step by step generated more precise questions to address through learn and explore modules. It was really interesting also to see from a visual perspective how the design language of scientists and different stakeholders was inspiring us as designers in achieving interesting visual representations for our project. I will demo the project for you in a few moments, building up suspense, but first it's worthwhile to mention its structure again, because modularity for the Senses Toolkit, I think it's a key concept that we try to develop from the beginning. As we had a very wide a set of topics that we wanted to cover, as Dr. Auer already pointed out, we divided in 3 conceptual areas, which are learn, explore, and share. Cornelia already presented the ideas behind the concept behind those 3 sections, but from a design perspective, we wanted to make the learn modules as explanative and easy to follow as possible. So we use techniques such as storytelling or guided exploration, charts that build up, interactive reports, and so on. While for the explore part, we let the user more able to engage and use the data as they wanted. So we built interfaces that were less explanatory and more explorative. Regarding the share part, we didn't actually plan for a unique section. It's more that every module and every content that is inside the toolkit also provide a section where you can actually download and reuse the material for your for presentations or for other projects. But now, and also before that, before the demo again, we already provided a very wide variety of topics, but we are also working through towards a new set of modules, both from a learn and a explore perspective, such as land use transition, global mitigation pathways, while on finance, we will focus more on extending the transition risks, talking also about the power sector and the end use sectors, and the investment needs and alignment. So we finally reached the demo time. So I will change my share. So this is the homepage of climatescenarios.org. As you will scroll down, you can see that you will encounter each module that has been created for Senses. You can either select and navigate the modules as you want, or you can use the filter functions and filter by audience, by type, or by meaningful questions. If the user is new to climate scenarios, of course, the primer is a good starting point. The primer is a collection of text and visualizations that we developed in order to help the user understand detailed aspects of climate scenarios and to help them get better into the topic. But obviously, there are also other kinds of users with more advanced need, also from a learning perspective. So we worked on very specific questions, such as global how electricity will look like in the future, and how our energetic sector will look like. And towards an electric future is exactly talking about this. We are using here storytelling, and we are helping the user to build visualization stepwise, allowing for an interaction that will help them grasping even complex views on data. Last but not least, we have explore modules, which from an interface and design point of view are way more free to be explored by the user. For example, the scenario finder that will be later presented in greater detail allow you to do selections, but also to just look at all the models that are present in a database. And with this, my introduction to the toolkit is done. I hope you will find time to explore it better, and I pass it to my colleagues.
Thank you very much, Francesca. Fantastic. So you concluded nicely the part A of this webinar. So you got a lot of information to digest, and let's see if there are already some preliminary burning questions. So Henrik, we have been monitoring the chat. If there's anything that you found you wanted to raise, I would like you to use, again, I would like to remind you to use the chat function and to write down your question, and then Henrik will read them during the Q&A moment. So Henrik, can you, there are no questions at the moment, right? I have been browsing, but I don't see.
No, so far we have no questions, so I will assume that everything is crystal clear. Perhaps we will see questions when going more into detail in the individual modules.
Yes.
So let's see.
Thank you, Henrik. So indeed, let's move on to part B. So as Henrik mentioned, now we're going to go to zoom in into the specific modules. And there will be short pitches that will be started by Elmar Kriegler. I will not take more time from you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Simona. You can probably see my screen. And please, to all participants, we are prepared to take questions and looking forward to your feedback. So please make use of the chat if you have a question. So I will jump into the primer to climate scenarios. And as you can see in the toolkit, it already says if you're new to scenarios, you should start here. So let's start here. The primer starts off with description of what climate change scenarios are and what their role is. And I briefly touched upon this already in my introductory presentation. So there is these two types of scenarios, the projection, what can happen, and the pathways towards a long-term goal, a target-seeking or goal-oriented scenarios. Doesn't need to be long-term, by the way. So this gives you the framing. It also talks here about the types of scenarios that are out there, from socioeconomic scenarios to impact scenarios to integrated scenarios. Now let's move to the next topic, which is now connecting the different scenarios from the different modeling types. Because when we look at climate change, we do have this loop here. Socioeconomic development leads to energy and land use, which causes emissions, causing climate change, greenhouse gas emissions and other climate forces here, causing climate change, causing climate impacts, and then impacting socioeconomic development. That is the loop that also scenarios try to close. And if you look further down here, we go through these various items. And explain quickly which models are used for exploring this particular dimension, what type of scenarios you're encountering here, and then also point out the policy intervention points here. One is mitigation, so to break the link between socioeconomic development and emissions, and another one is adaptation, to break the link between climate change and adverse impacts on societies. Now, with this introduction, we go, as you can see here in the menu, through the individual items. Starting with socioeconomic development, we talk about ways to develop socioeconomic scenarios, which are mostly based on narratives. And we focus here particularly, of course, on climate change scenarios and the new scenario concepts that are used there. A critical concept here are the so-called shared socioeconomic pathways that you might have heard about already. So this page is introducing you to the concept of the SSPs, the 5 SSPs. There are some sketches here on the narratives. And then we move on into the next part. So I'm doing this very fast just to give you a teaser. Don't expect that that you can fully follow what I'm saying here, because that will take half an hour or maybe 40 minutes, and I invite you to go through it in detail after the webinar. So this is on the IEMs in detail. Showing you the basic concept of IEMs. You have some interaction. If you impose a carbon tax, then the emissions are decreasing, these kind of things, just giving you a feel, because IEMs are used to convert to emission scenarios. Then we explain here available IEMs and the representation, and also show some of their outputs. Moving on to mitigation, I'm speeding up a bit here because I'm running out of time. We explain how then the target orientation, the long-term radiative forcing, and also the temperature outcomes are linked into those are combined with the socioeconomic storylines, and how IAMs are used to fill such a matrix between the radiative forcing and temperature levels in the rows and the SSPs, the shared socioeconomic pathways, in the columns. And there are some animations you can see here where you can look at different SSPs and the temperature outcome. Moving on to climate change. This is giving you an introduction to climate change projections. Moving on to climate impacts, where you can then go here through various model comparisons on various sectors. You can see biomes, coastal infrastructure, energy, these kind of things. And finally, we cap it off with adaptation and giving you a short introduction how adaptation scenarios are developed and how also co-production processes to develop adaptation storylines are occurring. So this is giving you an introduction into the primer. And with that, I hand over to the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Elmar, as usual on time. Actually, you had even more time, but I didn't want to interrupt the flow.
Oh, okay. But let's go ahead. Maybe others can make good use of the time.
Perfect. So I hand over the floor to Christoph on the missions graph.
Yeah, thanks, Simona. And as you said, I'll show you now. This is my, okay, sorry. The screen sharing did not first work. So now it should work. So yes, this is the kind of first more topical module to be presented today, where we wanted to kind of tell the story of kind of what kind of the stock take of the current situation with international climate policy leads to, and how kind of the lack of ambition and what can be transformed into kind of an emissions gap can be bridged by strengthened policies. So I give you a very short 3-minute intro for this module, but then also show you how this module is linked with further content that you can explore. So the starting point is kind of the current status of emissions having increased up until the year 2019 and being composed both of, like here in gray, fossil fuel emissions, but then also shown in green above CO2 emissions from the land use system. And if we kind of take the Paris Agreement climate goals in earnest, then we see that kind of in order to reach a 1.5 or 2 degree temperature target, we need to bring CO2 emissions both from fossil fuels in industry and from the land use system to zero around 2050 in order to reach the 1.5 degree target. But even for the more lenient 2 degree target, we just have roughly 2 decades more of time for bringing emissions to zero. And if we contrast this with kind of like the outlook of where emissions are headed given current plans of different countries in the so-called NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, we see that these contributions add up to just kind of plateauing emissions, but not at all the decrease that is required for reaching long-term targets. In that view, we bring this together with information on low-carbon power sector investments, and you see that these would, even with these rather modest country pledges, likely increase over the next decade with a bit more than $500 billion per year average investments. But if we now contrast this scenario with kind of a target-based scenario that reaches to a 1.5 degree target in a cost-efficient manner, we see that under such a scenario, as shown here in yellow, emissions would decrease already quite a bit until 2030, and concurrent with that, we would see more than a doubling of yearly low-carbon power sector investments. We can now look into the further 2 decades up until mid-century and see that for kind of such a scenario where we just go with current trajectories, there would then be kind of a very immense challenge ahead to still reach zero emissions in just 2 decades time, as you can see here on the right hand side with this massive jump from the investment level up until 2030 to the investment level that you would see later on. And this is kind of the motivation for looking at a scenario where we kind of strengthen the national policy plans in each country with different kind of practices based on a best practice analysis in other countries, and see that with such a scenario, we kind of have also a more gradual increase of these low carbon power investments over time, with a doubling up until 2030 and another doubling afterwards, and be much closer along the trajectory of the cost optimal pathway. Without going further into the details of this module, just I wanted to let you see here that kind of in this last view, we also help you to explore further, so you can go back to all the different indicators that have been looked at during the course of the module, and you can then also change these assumptions. So for example, change from a 2 degree, from 1.5 degrees trajectories to 2 degree trajectory, but you can also vary the assumption on how much carbon dioxide removal options are available. In the default view, we showed you how that looks like under full availability, and you see that there would be these huge negative emissions in the second half of the century. If we assume that these are not so much available anymore, you see immediately that then we basically just have the option left to start with optimal policies right now, because otherwise with this assumption of lower CDR availability, 1.5 degree cannot be reached. So stopping here with this more content-wise explanations on this module, I show you that further down, you have here this link to 4 guided explore modules, which I opened here. And then you see that here you already have 4 different questions that you can explore. And in each of them, you even have further more explorative questions. And just kind of as a small snapshot here, for example, you see the emissions trajectories for different subcomponents. So for example, if you look here on the left-hand side, energy supply emissions would need to be even at 0 earlier than the total CO2 emissions from energy, as the power sector is something where kind of mitigation options are more abundantly available. And then like just the last point on these investment guided explore module, where again you can see kind of the individual components of different low carbon investments, solar, wind, and so forth. And what I wanted to show you as the last point of this short intro to the emissions gap module is that you can also open all this data in the YASA Scenario Explorer. So opening this link will lead you first to something where you kind of still have to confirm, but then actually this always takes a bit. So I opened that already in another tab, which you then see here. And here you really are at the data with a lot of other scenarios at reach. So you could change here the scenario that is shown and compare kind of the results that we have presented so far for the models that are kind of represented in the Senses project, but give you here the chance to have the same kind of views with all other scenarios available in that vast database. So with that, I close and hand over back to Simona.
Many thanks, Christoph. Nice on time, everyone. So now I would like to start the Q&A session. So before passing the word to Henrik, our co-moderator, I would like just to ask a quick question to Cornelia, our coordinator, from a participant that had a very quick question review on the recording. Will this be available, Cornelia? And then I'll pass over to Henrik.
I just answered it. It's a data protection topic. We are recording, then we have it checked by our data protection department. And if we can hand out the recording as is, then people who have signed up for the newsletter will receive an information, and otherwise parts are very highly probable to show up on the toolkit page itself.
Okay, thank you very much. That was just a quick question for people that needed to drop and come in. I'll hand over to you, Henrik. Thank you.
Just a question, Simona, is do we have a presentation of BUS before going into Q&A, or do you want Q&As now?
Maybe we have the time. I think it's a good idea to go on then with BUS presentation. Yes.
Okay.
That's a good suggestion. Thank you. Bas, would you like to go on with your presentation then, before we open the floor?
Yes, let's do
Thank you.
that. Let me share this one. So I want to tell you a little bit about one of the finance modules that we developed that is focusing on the transition risk of phasing out fossil fuels. And it is one out of 3 modules on the finance sector that are currently in development. And this is the one that you can look at now. And I skipped through some of the introductory information here to show you that we are looking at 3 types of risk actually in this module. First, quantity risk, which is the risk of investors to the fact that we are phasing out these fuels, and this is the strongest observed, of course, in coal. Then uncertainty risk, where the trajectory for not all of these fuels is actually the same, and especially if you look at the trajectories for natural gas and oil, these can be relatively different under different scenarios or assumptions or different modeling tools, and that in itself is changes your risk profile. And then there is the revenue risk, where we don't only look into the quantity of the fuel, but also the combination with the price and the total economic activity in that sector, and how the revenues of this sector actually are influenced by mitigation. And so quantity risk is, we show here based on the example of coal, because coal is the fuel that is phased out most rapidly under mitigation. And what you see here is how under a current policy scenario, the expectation would be for coal use to actually grow into the future. But if we want to limit warming to 2 degrees, we need to really quickly drive down on the global level the use of coal. And if we want to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, that needs to be even faster and fiercer. Now this is at the global level, but if you look also, you can look here at individual regions, and if you look, for instance, at the region of the OECD, you see that even though there is already a declining trend in this region, in order to limit warming to 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees, this declining trend needs to be sped up until really phasing out coal by mid-century. So that is for quantity risk, and this is where you would have the option actually to evaluate issues like stranded assets against these type of indicators, and how the present day assets or expectation of assets into the future actually holds up against these production numbers for these regions. So uncertainty risk is a little more complicated, because this here we focus actually on the change per decade, so the growth per decade across all of these 3 fuels. And what you see here, you see for coal, natural gas, and oil, for the different decades over the course of the 21st century, you see the slope of this line indicating the growth rate of these fuels. And for coal, you see basically the same figure that we just saw here for a 2-degree scenario as one example. You see that between the 2020s and 2030s, there's a steep decline in the use of coal. And then afterwards, there is not much change, basically because coal is being phased out after that. Natural gas and oil, you see different patterns. And especially now, if we look at multiple scenarios, if we have in blue here a current policy scenario, in orange a 2-degree, and in yellow a 1.5 degree scenario, you see how the trajectories are different over the course of the century, where you see this initial growth in the current policy, sort of a flattening and then a decrease in the 2 degrees and a steeper decrease in the 1.5 degree scenario. Now this is the uncertainty across different scenarios, but if we bring in multiple models that have generated these scenarios, and you can see those here as sort of thinner lines behind the trajectory of the single model that we highlighted, you can see that there are really different trajectories. Let me focus here. We had now this first one example actually from the Remind model. If we look at message here, you will see, for instance, that under a 2-degree scenario, there can still be an increase in the use of natural gas at the global level, and then later phase out. And so this is the type of uncertainty that actually, if you flip between these models, this is the type of uncertainty between scenarios and between model quantifications that makes it hard to give one clear message on how these fuels will evolve. And so the final visualization in this module is on revenues. And here the basic paradigm of this visualization is that we have blocks of a no policy scenario again, or current policy actually in blue, 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees in yellow. And then the bigger these blocks are, the bigger the revenues, right? And you see that for coal, the expectation in the current policy is to grow, but under 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees, actually the revenues in this sector are basically reduced to almost zero compared to the expectations under the current policy scenario. So this is a big change that you see here in this sector, not only in the quantity, but also in the dollar volume of the revenue of that total sector. This is a little less outspoken for gas and for oil. And you can then highlight individual regions, individual large chunks of the world to actually look at how these revenues change over time for these individual regions under the different scenarios. So here you can also then evaluate investments against the revenue risk in these sectors. Yeah, so with that, I want to thank the contributors to this module, especially Nico, Nadia, Francesca, and Fidel, and hand back to Simona.
Many thanks, Bas. Nice and concise. So now I would like to open the floor for the Q&A, and I hand over directly to Henrik.
Thank you, Simona, and thank you, presenters, so far. We fully realized that we put a lot of information to you, and we got some questions back. And I will try to cluster the questions somewhat so that we get more than one answers in for each of the questions. So I have 2 sets of questions, actually. One is more about the methods we have applied, the process and the project as a whole, and the other one is more on substance. Let's start with the first one. And the first question is perhaps about evaluation and how we really involve stakeholders in the development of the modules and the toolkits as such. So I was wondering if, Francesca, would you be prepared to respond on the questions regarding evaluation and stakeholder involvement in the process?
Yes, sure. Thanks for the question. It's actually really interesting. And for the sake of time, we left it a little bit out. The evaluation process was actually divided in several phases. Part of the evaluation was done to get very closely to some stakeholders, in some cases where we involved people that were outside of the consortium and helped us in developing and refining the visualizations and the concept that we were already working on. Because especially for Learn module, the process was also done in we would call it in a tandem fashion, where we had one scientist and one designer working together, and then we had eventually a stakeholder jumping in and providing feedback. And that was, let's say, the normal loop of evaluation that was happening inside each Learn module, to always be sure that the consistency of results of what we were presenting was there. But then during the workshops, we also had more formal evaluation phases with questionnaires. We collected qualitative feedback as together also as semi-quantitative feedback. And the idea was to have a more broad view of how the toolkit is perceived. So how trustworthy it is, how modules are used by different kind of users. So we actually played it on 2 levels, let's say, more on the content at the beginning, and then later more generally also on the user experience part of the design. I hope I answered. If not, raise your hand.
Well, it's difficult to raise hands here because we're so many participants. So we prefer actually to use the chat room. So if you have more questions on this, please come back. So we will take a few questions now and we'll have another session soon. Thank you, Francesca. Next question is about, we had a few questions about underlying data and the availability of data. And for example, if this is only data endorsed by the IPCC, or is it if it's more data, and if it can be used fully open source for further research. And I would like to perhaps direct this question to Elmar. Are you prepared to answer this question, Elmar?
Yes, I can do that. So first, the idea is with the services to have a prototypical example. So we are not in providing this toolkit kind of doing an assessment like the IPCC is doing and then saying, okay, look, this is the preferred set of scenarios that should be used and that's the type of prices that are right and these kind of things. So that's not our intention here. It's rather to bring that information to the users in a way that they can make their own assessment and also of course, draw connections between an IPCC assessment, for example, the last IPCC assessment that has looked into the mitigation scenarios and emission scenarios in detail was a special report on 1.5 degree warming. So you will find links to this scenario data in our toolkit and in our modules, and also a link to the scenario explorer hosted at YASA that provides these scenarios under a license which allows you to use it non-commercially, this scenario data. And I mean, on the license, both for the Explorer and also for the data we have here, it's basically public available, but maybe Bas and Francesca can say a bit more. But what I'm saying here is that this is about communication. It's not so much about assessing the available scenario information and indicating what would be a scientist-based assessment of it or not, if that helps.
Thank you, Elmar. I would like to continue on, sorry, I shut down my video for some reason. I would like to continue about a little bit on future plans for the toolkit. And there has been several questions about amateur modules and future modules, for example, in regards to different specific sectors of society. So is this something I can hand over to Cornelia? Cornelia, are you willing to say something about our future plans about additional modules, please?
Yeah, I'm very happy to do so. So I have a backup slide, and now for the course of the project, our future modules will be one here within the policy topics on land use transitions. We look very much forward to that. Then one about solving the variability challenge of wind and solar power. This is very hands-on information for stakeholders. And also on co-producing adaptation strategies. Here is where the regional and the global scenarios come together and how strategies can be co-produced. And then, of course, for finance, Bas was presenting the fossil fuel phase-out part. There will be further modules, one on investment needs and alignment of financial investments or businesses to the climate targets. Then about the transition risk, there will be a module on the power sector transition and one on the so-called risk factor pathways. I don't go into detail here, but there's a lot to come in the finance part and also many interesting topics to expect here on the policy side.
Thank you, Cornelia. Okay, now let's move a little bit more into questions of substance. And I think that the first sort of framing questions around substance is about degree of detail in the different scenarios. We have a few questions about, for example, comparing details of mitigation scenarios compared to impacts and adaptation scenarios, and also details across different scales, from the global scales down to the regional and local scales. And this is something that we are looking into right now in Senses, but I would like to direct this to the PI Elmar again, if you could kind of give an overview of the details. I fully understand that we have a global focus so far, but several participants seems to be interested in more regional information. So please, Elmar, could you elaborate a little bit on this topic?
Yeah, that's great. It's a great set of questions. So ultimately, we would like to bridge the scales and integrate more in the scenario domain. And so that is why we in Senses included not only mitigation scenarios, but we included also impact projections, particularly those that are provided by the ECMIP project. And my colleague Jan Volkholz will talk a bit later about a module that tries to bring some of this information forward. We also have a sister project, Easypedia, that is focusing entirely on impact projections. And the next step is, of course, a question on integration. So what a service can do is, of course, take the available science and then try to bring it to the users in a best possible way. But the service itself cannot do science in the sense of integrating if it hasn't been done before. So what we want to do is a flexible toolkit that then can take up the latest on integration between impacts and mitigation as it develops. And similar story for bridging the scales. We deliberately included our colleagues from Wageningen and Stockholm Environment Institute here, and we ran 2 case studies on national adaptation planning, if you want, one in the Netherlands and one in Kenya. This gives another rich set of information we didn't talk much about so far, but there's definitely the question of how to bring together the global scenarios and regional scenarios. We do have a few modules like a co-production, a learn module, an explore module on co-production techniques, and we also want to have a module on adaptation, which will, by definition, try to bridge the scales.
Thank you, Elmar. We have time for a few more questions, and I do realize and I see that more questions are coming in, and it's tricky for me to digest and cluster them now while talking. So those questions will be raised in few further Q&A a little bit later on. We have one question, a constructive critical questions on the perhaps primary module in the whole toolkit, and that is the module on the primer, where we try to introduce and explain what climate scenarios really are and how different types of scenarios relate to each other. And the question is about, I mean, if you remember the wheel that we showed here, that certain societal development will lead to some emissions, which in turn will lead into concentration of greenhouse gases, which will lead into changing climate, and you will have impacts and adaptation, etc. So the question is about this. So it looks very sequential, this kind of structure, where we try to explain how different scenarios relate to each other. And the comment and question is about, there are certainly other links in between those. For example, the socioeconomic development will influence the vulnerability of one and a given climate change. So have we sort of critically oversimplified how the different types of scenarios relate to each other? This is my best way of how to frame this. Is there, I don't have a particular, Elmar, are you willing to take also this one?
Yeah, I can do this.
Yeah.
And it's a good point. So, I mean, we put it in a loop in order to show that these things depend together. But the question is, of course, could in the loop be there's some little loop in between? When you have socioeconomic development, it increases or it lowers, depending on the development, the adaptive capacity, and increases the vulnerability or lowers the vulnerability. We try to bring this in by a second, by having the loop a second time and showing the intervention points. Maybe we should have also a few arrows here. But the basic idea of the primer is to try to give the user an introduction on this large field of climate change scenarios, because they are, of course, those projections from the Earth system models, the climate change projections we know about. There are these impact projections. We have heard about socioeconomic scenarios, the shared socioeconomic pathways, for example. Then we have these emissions and energy and land use scenarios from the integrated assessment models. And we wanted to give in the primer an idea how these things hang together and how they are connected, and also give an indication where they are not connected enough yet. So we also point out in the primer that particularly the loop from the climate change to the impact on societies is a research frontier. It's not only looking at the climate change projections, it's also looking at the socioeconomic developments, which is, I guess, the point that was made. So more research needs to be done here, and we of course hope at some time when research progresses to update some of these toolkits here. By the way, one last thing, if you look through, at least for the primer, that's true, and come to the last page, you also can submit feedback on those modules to some email address, I think. So please make use of that if you identify something that you think is kind of missing in the primer or other modules.
Thank you, Elmar. Thank you so much. This is, of course, a tricky balance act, trying to simplify in order to communicate, but on the other hand, not simplifying too much. There is certainly room for improvement here. I think we have time for one final question here, and that is how we represent negative emission technologies in general in scenarios. Are these interpreted as policy interventions, or are they built into the scenarios? And I was wondering if, Folke, you haven't given your presentation yet, but Folke, would you be prepared to say something about this topic?
Yeah, sure, Henrik, happy to do so. I mean, unfortunately, there is probably no simple answer to this question. There are scenarios where negative emission technologies such as bioenergy with CCS are really treated as a policy intervention. I mean, exploring their implication and to what degree they can make a difference. There are other scenarios which essentially see it as a technology that is part of the generally available portfolio. So that very much depends on the study at hand. So there is unfortunately no broad-brushed answer to the question.
And I guess it's correct to add, Folke, that this is nothing that Senses as such has looked into. We have collected the available scenarios out there and trying to digest them for stakeholders and decision makers.
Yeah, Senses, as it was not designing scenarios, at least global scenarios per se, but rather looking into ways of communicating that did not look into it. I will, however, in the next presentation, actually show an example how some of the Senses tools can be used to identify scenarios that may be suitable to answer specific questions that relate to negative emission technologies.
Very good, Folke. And I think this is a very good example of something that could be communicated even better. And this is obviously a very hot topic about how to represent negative emission technologies in mitigation scenarios, especially. So it will be good if we can do something better on that. We look forward to your presentation, Folke. And with that, I would like to hand over to Simona again.
Yeah, thank you, Henrik. It was a perfect bridge for the next part. So we just went through part A, which was more about the examples of learning modules that are a bit more higher level and more generic. Now we are going to give an example, two examples actually, first with Folke and then with Jan Folkholz on our explore modules, which go more in detail, more granular data. So without further taking time, I give the floor to Folke. Thank you.
Thank you, Simona. I hope everybody can see my screen. I would like to spend a few minutes now introducing the so-called scenario finder. The scenario finder is a tool that essentially builds on a scenario that I'm not supposed to be expert users who don't necessarily need to have in-depth knowledge of the underlying scenario literature to identify scenarios or scenario sets that are relevant for the questions and use cases at hand. This is done by enabling a search for certain qualitative or quantitative characteristics of the scenarios. I will show you a few examples in a minute. For instance, here on the left-hand side of the screen, qualitative characteristics include obviously scenario name and the model that produced those scenarios. This is already pretty much in-depth knowledge. Or, for example, a temperature category that these scenarios have been assigned to. Here you can see, for example, a range of temperature categories that were used in the IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees. And I'll use that in a minute to give you a more in-depth example of how to utilize that tool. And then there are quantitative indicators. For example, here, median warming at temperature peak. Relevant to the last questions that we discussed, cumulative deployment of bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, so negative emissions specifically, or final energy use at some point in time, in this example, end of the century. There are more of these different indicators that are available. Let me not go into detail here. They fall into different categories, and we are actually expanding on the indicators that can be used here for identifying suitable scenario sets. Now, to come back to my original example, this is built on top of the IPCC, the scenarios used in the IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees. There are roughly 400 scenarios in here, so quite a lot. Let me now use the example of identifying 1.5 degree compatible scenarios with low overshoot that at the same time make limited use of bioenergy with CCS and achieve mitigation primarily by reducing energy demand, so emphasizing efficiency as an example for how to utilize this tool. So the first item can be achieved by selecting here the appropriate category. So this would be 1.5 degree scenarios with low overshoot. That gets us down to 44 out of the original 416 scenarios. So considerably less, but still quite a few. You also see the implications for median peak warming on this histogram here in the middle, where the darker shaded gray indicates where the set of selected scenarios sits relative to the full distribution that is shown here. You can also see the distribution of cumulative BECCS deployment. That, I mean, this is slightly visible, the darker gray here, but you see it spans essentially the whole range between 0 and 1,000 gigatons CO2. And let me now identify those scenarios that actually make limited use of it. And let's pick, this is very easy to do by moving this bar on the histogram. So let's say we are happy with something like up to 200 gigatons of BECCS deployment. And that gets us then down to 7 out of the total 416 scenarios. Final step, let us limit final energy use. As a proxy, I would suggest we look for scenarios that by the end of the century have final energy in the same range as today, so a bit more than 400 exajoules per year, and that ultimately then gets us down to 3 scenarios. You see here their characteristics when it comes to the 5 indicators that are currently shown on the screen. They come from 3 different modeling frameworks, actually from 3 different studies also, as indicated here by the scenario names. And now, similarly to what Christoph was presenting earlier, this tool is fully integrated with the Scenario Explorer so that it enables you to take a deeper dive into the underlying scenarios and also download the data in case you're interested to do so. So I'm logged already into the Scenario Explorer, but let me just click this link. I then just need to confirm that I would like to open that in a new window. And then it opens dynamically generated based on my choice before so-called workspace. I again have to confirm that I want to open this here. This takes a second. In this case, it should actually be fairly quick. And here on the right-hand side, you see a panel with the 3 scenarios selected that we identified in the Scenario Explorer. It uses here the example of capacity of biomass electricity generation. But let me show you, this is very easy to change. Actually, we go in here, and then let's say would like to look at total CO2 emissions. I choose that, apply it, and ultimately we see here how these trajectories evolve for the 3 scenarios that we've identified. There's also the possibility to look at numerical data, or as you can see here, download the portions of the data or the entire database snapshot. Given that the question came up, let me emphasize that that scenario ensemble is actually available for research purposes. So the license actually allows commercial as well as non-commercial as well as commercial use. So in this case, I guess data availability as put forward as a question should not be an issue. Let me stop here, and I'm happy to take questions later on if useful.
Thank you, Volker. That was very interesting. Now we go to the second part of this Explore module part with Jan Volkholz, who will show us Senses Earth. And then after that, we're going to go to the Q&A. I can offer you 1 more minute, Jan, because I gave it a bit more time to Volker. So. We can see you, but we can't hear you. Let me see. Jan, you're muted. You need to unmute.
Yeah, sorry, I got it now, I hope.
Perfect.
Can you hear me?
Yeah,
okay, I start again, sorry. So this is the Senses Earth Toolkit. This is about extreme events under global warming. And this is data that has been obtained by running many, many impact models. Impact models are models that simulate, for instance, forests or agriculture or hydrology, things like that. And all these models were run in a streamlined way, meaning they used all the same input data, so they are comparable. So the data is spatially resolved. The pixel is about 50 by 50 kilometers, and you can look at the whole Earth. You can zoom in, zoom out, you can rotate it. And we looked at 6 different types of extreme events. So we looked at drought, at crop failure, drought, heat waves, river floods, tropical cyclones, and wildfire. And if you want to know what precisely this means, because people have different definitions what this is, we wrote everything up here under the learn more. If you learn more, you can see what exactly we mean. So we looked at 4 different levels of global warming. So pre-industrial world, 0. 1 degree world, which is right now, so you can see what already happened. And then we look at 1.5 degree and 2 degree of global warming. And in order to have a more robust assessment and provide some uncertainty level, we use 4 different climate models. So here you can see these 4 different climate models. And depending on the extreme event category, you have a different number of impact models. For tropical cyclones, there's only 1, but for droughts, for instance, you can see there's 8. So, okay, so again, so then you can pick your climate model and impact model combinations. So for instance, we take these 2, and then you can see here you have the scale, and then you can see what the impact models provide as a scenario. This is pretty nice because it allows you to see the model spread. So, you know, like different models give somewhat different answers. So as a user, you can actually see how similar or how different are the models. What we also provide is the so-called median. So this is a more robust sum of all the data together. So we pick of all GCM, of all climate model and of all impact model combinations, we pick the median value. So you get like a kind of robust assessment, but please be aware that this also cuts out the extremes. So I think this is a quick overview from me. I mean, if you have questions, just ask. Simona, I think I hand it back to you.
Many thanks, Jan. Yeah, actually, the presentation was very interesting. I was also keeping an eye on the lots of questions that were rising up on your chat. So without further ado, I pass the mic to Henrik. So Henrik, you have more than 10 minutes until 25. Yeah,
Thank you, Simona.
thank you.
Yes, let's see. Let's go into the questions again. And the first cluster of questions is about the finance sector again. And there are actually, I think, two subsets of questions here. We talk in regards to risk, we talk about usually physical risks and transition risks. And transition risks is, as you probably know, related to policy interventions or perhaps changing consumer patterns, etc. Whereas physical risks are direct risks related to the impacts of climate change. And the question was that in the finance module, do we include physical risks to the financial sector at all, or do we only consider transition risks? And the other question related to the finance sector is it possible and for an investor, for example, using our tool to assess or doing a portfolio risk management analysis and linking our data to certain companies, specific companies, and see, for example, a risk profile of a set of companies in relation to impacts of climate change? And I guess those are questions to Elmar again. Elmar, are you prepared to elaborate a little bit on this?
Yeah, the first part on the physical risk, I can say a few words, and then I would hand over to Christoph on trying to link to individual companies this information. So first on the physical risk, this is right now still a gap in the Senses Toolkit. We are of course fully aware that there are transition and physical risks, and some of the information that Jan presented right now on heat waves, tropical cyclones, this is very relevant for an assessment of physical risk, but so far it's not yet in a format that investors could directly maybe use it and take it to assess their physical risk. So for the time being, they have to use Senses Earth that Jan just presented and then do the extrapolation themselves. In the long run, I think it would be important to add a module on physical risk, specifically on physical risk, not only on extreme events as we are planning to do, and also we have with Senses Earth to the toolkit. It will not happen during the lifetime of Senses. Senses is going to end this year, but we hope maybe I can use that to say that this toolkit becomes a living ecosystem where we can add when this toolkit has an institutional afterlife, more and more new modules to it, and physical risk would be high on the list. Now, on the question whether the transition risk information can be linked to companies, there's a concept called risk factor pathways. I would like to hand over to you, Christoph, to say a few words on this.
Yeah, sure. So I guess the main statement is that direct company information is not part of what we provide here with that toolkit, but there are different approaches, both from kind of private consultancies, but also from more general like institutions like the UNEP FI framework that try to kind of build also open source infrastructures and methodologies to link scenario data to company performance. The risk factor pathway that Elmar has just mentioned would be one of those, which kind of allows you to see kind of the sectoral profiles of these scenarios. And then the link to individual companies is obviously kind of a second step that would still require input by kind of analysts from the finance sector side.
Thank you, Elmar and Christoph. Now we also have a cluster of questions related to local. I was muted again, I'm sorry. Now we have a small cluster of questions related to impacts of climate change at the local and regional level, and also adaptation strategies. And I will actually try to respond to those myself for a few seconds, because I've been engaged in the local case studies that was mentioned by Elmar. So one of the questions was about how detailed questions regarding impacts of climate change has been used in the regional case studies. And we have tried in the project to downscale both climate scenarios, but also impact scenarios, as well as socioeconomic scenarios. And I will call the latter the main invention here, trying to combine downscale socioeconomic scenarios with impact scenarios, so that vulnerability is dependent on two factors: impacts of climate change, but also how socioeconomic change could develop in the future. So we actually combine different types of scenarios at the local scale. And this is not yet implemented as a module in the toolkit, but this is something that will happen relatively quickly after the summer. We will provide guidelines on how global scenarios regarding climate signal, impact signal, and also socioeconomics could be feasibly downscaled to the local and regional scale in order to improve, for example, comparability between different case studies, which is indeed a problem in impacts and adaptation studies, that it's very, very difficult to compare different case studies at different regions. That is one question. The other question regarding adaptation strategies was that if we have studied also financial decisions in relation to reduce vulnerability. And the answer in the 2 case studies that we have done is simply no. We have only considered the decisions in relation to direct physical risks at the local and regional scale. But of course, this is also an interesting avenue to go along, trying to include, for example, investors' relations and investors' decision in relation to local and regional impacts of climate change. So that was my attempt trying to address those 2 questions. Then I think we have time for at least one more. And I think it's a relatively straightforward question which we have not thought about, but I will still pose it. It's about, do we have any plans to translate the information here to other languages than English? So I will hand over this question to Cornelia. And I can just guess the answer, but please.
Like plans we don't have. I have heard that there was first steps to translate the primer to Japanese. The thing is that our modules are not set up to be multilingual. So I think within Senses this might not happen anymore, but I could imagine that maybe the primer could be something where we have different languages. That would be a start, a realistic start. I mean, if there's some funding from somewhere, of course, one could think of more, but of course, it would be highly desirable.
Thank you, Connie. And the primer would, of course, be the nice thing to start with, trying to explain how different climate scenarios fit together. Thank you, Cornelia, and thank you all. I think that with this, we close the Q&A and hand back to Simona again, and yeah, I guess Elmar and Connie for some final words. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Henrik. If you wanted, there was still time for one question, maybe one very small question. Maybe I will hand indeed over the floor to our coordinator. So first of all, Cornelia, maybe Cornelia, you can tell us something about this webinar and maybe the newsletter, because there was lots of interest in the comments on the floor.
I'm very happy to. So first of all, I would like to thank all the participants. We were really happy to see the great interest in our toolkit, and there will be a second presentation towards autumn when all the final modules are made and the whole toolkit is finalized. So if you want to sign up for the newsletter, I put my email address in the chat, but you can also find our contact emails on the toolkit website. Drop us an email and we will keep you updated. And with this from me also, thanks to the speakers, and I'll hand over to Elmar finally.
Yeah, thank you, Connie, and thank you in particular for organizing this webinar. I think it ran smoothly. It was also for us a new experience to have live demos and have so many different live demos. So we were a bit nervous in the beginning how this would work out, and I think it worked out really well. Thank you to the participants for staying with us for 90 minutes. I hope you got an impression what the toolkit is about and what the underlying concept is. So one takeaway point would be that we would like to convey is to make the case for climate change scenario services. So it is really what we tried to do here is to give an example of climate change scenario services, which is not so much about the science of scenarios, but it's about providing the insights that you can learn from scenarios and empowering users to use the scenarios themselves in order to make most use of what we develop. How it will continue, was already indicated by Cornelia for the project. We still have to complete the toolkit with additional modules. We then will have additional outreach events. But of course, another question that we are discussing right now is how the afterlife of the project will look like, because that is a resource that we hope will then continue to be used and continue to grow and be developed over time after Senses has completed. And for that, we will do some, we will have some ideas. One thing we should maybe mention here, maybe I can give you the very final word, Francesca, is on the various tools, not the modules that are produced, but the design tools that are out there that I think also open source and that then can be used to produce new Learn modules, new Explore modules, and keep this a living ecosystem and keep the scenario service going even after Senses.
Yes, the idea, thank you for giving me the words. We put a lot of effort from a development and design perspective to actually provide a library of components that is running on JavaScript, which is a little bit probably advanced. It's not so easy to, it's not just building blocks, it's not a backend where you can just input material, of course, but if there's skilled developers and there's people that are willing also to dive into the more front end and JavaScript part, we are offering a library with all the pieces to actually build visualization modules that are talking about climate change or other tools that can be provided. So it will be probably documented. We will have a documentation on how to use it. It's still building, it's already building up right now as we use it. So it would be great, I think. It would be really interesting to see what can be done further.
Many thanks, Francesca. I think we got all the words of thanks. Thank you very much for participating and for your feedback. Actually, the comments were also feedback for us. We'll elaborate in our project further. And with that, I would like to thank you and to have the next opportunity next time. Have a nice day.
Thank you, Simona.
Thank you, Simona, for moderating.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.
Thank you, Simona. Bye all. Bye-bye.